Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's so wild to be here in Ira Allen. God. I was afraid there'd be like this many people like just in this front area, and I was going to be publicly humiliated, but we got a decent crowd. You know, do we want to turn the lights down a little bit? Or is that, we didn't talk about that, I'm sorry, we should have rehearsed this. Is that possible to do without too much trouble? Because I'm going to be showing you slides, which I hope you can see okay. It's not quite as big as would be ideal. So I'm going to talk tonight about a little bit about my own college career and how the things I studied and did when I was in school connected to the work that I went on to do later. And I'm going to start by reading a short passage from Fun Home to you. My father didn't have much use for small children, but as I got older, he began to sense my potential as an intellectual companion. I should just say, I know a lot of you haven't read the book yet, but my dad was a high school English teacher. Years of neglect had left me wary, but then I ended up in his English class, a course called Rites of Passage, and I found that I liked the books Dad wanted me to read. Can people see? I'm sorry, people in the back probably can't see very good. If you want, some of you way back there, there's room on these sides, and there's screens on the sides that you could, if you want, come on up. Okay. Because I'm not going to read these out loud because I hate that when someone is reading out loud words that I'm looking at. It drives me insane. Sometimes it was as if Dad and I were the only ones in the room. The sensation of intimacy was novel. I think we were both starved for attention. We grew even closer after I went away to college. Books, the ones assigned for my English class, continued to serve as our currency. This is a passage from As I Lay Dying. Or no, this is a passage of a letter my dad wrote to me when I was in college, telling me how, can you read that? I'll shut up if you can read it. Okay. At first, I was glad for my father's help. My freshman English class, mythology and archetypal experience, confounded me. I didn't understand why we couldn't just read the books without forcing contorted interpretations on them. I was not alone in failing to grasp the symbolic function of literature. Our teacher frequently grew exasperated with the whole class. Our papers came back bloodied with red marks, most lavishly the withering WW for wrong word. But like a battered boxer, I kept swinging, buoyed up by my father's energetic coaching from the corner. Though now that I think of it, it's unclear whether he was the vicarious teacher or the vicarious student. Eventually, his excitement began to leave little room for my own. And by the end of the year, I was suffocating. Okay, so I did learn a lot from my father, but I also want to talk about this first-year English professor. And I thought I would show you some of my actual papers that I did for him. It was so brutal. It was a really traumatic class. And look at the grades I would get. My grades just seemed to get worse and worse. But I have to say, this is where I learned to write. When he said something was the wrong word, it was like, well, then what the hell is the right word? You know, it was like this, the idea that there was such a thing as a right word was very exciting. It was like this adventure. Primitive, wrong word. Wrong word. But I feel like this is where I learned to write. And on my final paper for this guy, which was on a portrait of the artist as a young man, I finally got a decent grade. I got a, what do you give me, a B plus A minus, or B plus A. I don't know how it can be a B plus A. He must have been end of the semester exhaustion. But I was so psyched. Look at this little, I got this little word, good, over there. See that? That was just so thrilling to me. And I remember the feeling of writing this paper, how exhilarated I was as I stayed up all night. It was my first all-nighter ever, and I'd been drinking Coke constantly to stay awake. So by dawn, I was getting kind of jittery as I was finishing it. And I was typing up this last paragraph, and it's referring, you can't see it, but it refers to the end of the book where Stephen Dedalus declares his determination to go off and become a writer. Here's the actual last passage of the book. And I was so excited because the day I was finishing the paper was actually April 27th, which is the date of Stephen's last diary entry in the book. Maybe that seems more exciting if you've been up all night. But it seemed like a cool coincidence to me at the time. But what my real exhilaration was about, as I wrote this paper, was the experience of being immersed in my ideas, of giving myself over to the creative process, even though my professor seems to have hated the word process. But when you're able to concentrate like that, to turn yourself over like that, coincidences do start to happen. Things start to rhyme and alliterate, and unconscious connections get made, and something greater than the sum of the parts starts to happen. If you're really doggedly and honestly engaged with a piece of work, then you can trust that those things will happen without you really doing anything else. All you have to do is do the work. And it was only after several years of grappling with my book, Fun Home, with writing that, trying to write the story of my father and me, that I realized it would begin with this scene of my father and me as Icarus and Daedalus, just like I had been writing in my freshman English paper. Maybe I didn't explain this, because the image of Stephen Dedalus flying off on his aesthetic journey is of Icarus, you know, flying up toward the sun. So I ripped that off, and I not only ripped Joyce off, I ripped myself off by just, you know, lifting this out of my freshman English paper. And I got a lot of mileage from my college papers. This is another paper I did for that guy. It was actually a creative writing assignment, and I got another good. And I think he what I did was I wrote about an argument I'd had with my mother once, and I had all the notes on it in my diary. So I basically just transcribed my diary for this creative writing assignment. So I think my teacher thought I made it up, but really it was just what had actually happened. And I recycled that into a scene in the book I wrote after Fun Home, a book about my mother. So hang on to all your assignments, because you never know when they're going to come in handy. Okay, when I think of the trajectory of my career, I'm reminded of one of my favorite pieces from Mad magazine, which I read obsessively as a kid. And this was a piece I saw for the first time when I was 12 years old in 1973, and it's really stuck with me. The idea is that this second grader writes his report about what he did that summer. He visits his grandfather's farm, and he writes, "I saw many pigs there. Some of the pigs saw me too, with their tiny eyes." And then he just goes on recycling this for a 6th grade report. "My grandpa grows pigs with very small eyes." For a junior high special extra credit science project, he writes about pigs. In high school, he reworks it into his remedial English paper on A Tale of Two Cities. It doesn't matter what class it's for, he can work pigs into it. He goes to college, and on his Intro to Psychology exam, he cites the case history of Bertha M., whose childhood trauma worsened when she found that pigs have small eyes and stare at people. I didn't realize this when I was a kid, but that's a funny allusion to Freud's groundbreaking case history of Anna O., whose real name was Bertha. He rewrites it again for a senior seminar paper. Additionally, pigs have remarkably small eyes with which they tend to stare at people. Then his master's thesis, the fact remains that pigs have very small eyes with which they stare at people. And finally, his dissertation in abnormal zoology, where he mentions the empirical relationship between the small size of the median swine eye as intensified through the eyelid blink factor. So I just found this so hilarious, and I just read it over and over, even all those little footnotes. And, you know, that was Dan Fogel. I can see now that what it's really about is it's a satire of academic writing, if not of academia in general. But to me, what it was about to me as a kid was this person who became more and more himself as he continued to explore his childhood fascination with pigs as far as he could, like to its logical extreme. And I really liked the idea that an experience could be so powerful that it just insisted on manifesting again and again in whatever you're doing in life. And I feel like that has been the case for me, and if one is lucky, that's kind of what happens in our lives. I feel like I've basically been doing the same thing all my life that I was doing as a small child. Guess that doesn't show up very well. This was a very early drawing of mine from before I really knew how to write. I must have been like 5. I was just learning letters and numbers, and I just loved the way that pictures and words look together. So even before I could write words, I was putting these symbols and letters and numbers in my pictures. It was just this weird thing. I loved how it looked. I made a newspaper when I was little. Like for my family, I draw these newspapers, and I've always loved newspapers because they're this wonderful combination of words and pictures, all laid out on a page together. I started writing stories that I would illustrate myself with pictures. At school, I would always draw in my notes. It's my 7th grade English notebook, math, French, social studies. And it only got worse when I went to college. This is modern art history, more modern art history. That was a very dull class. But the amount of drawings I was doing isn't really an index of how boring or interesting a class was. Often I drew when I was paying very close attention to what they were talking about. Ancient Greek, linguistics, logic, semiotics. So I just have always had this thing for words and pictures. That's what I'm trying to say. But I also did a lot of just plain drawing as a kid, almost constantly. I just have like reams of drawings that I made. I would show you some in chronological order. I drew all different kinds of characters and people. This is a cat cowboy. That's a general. Baseball players, astronauts, Canadian Mounties, lumberjacks, tough guys. I was very obsessed with that Charles Atlas ad in the comic books where the big guy kicks sand on the little guy. It's a recurring motif in my work. Musicians. I was a concert pianist with a cameraman. Door-to-door salesmen, mountain climbers, a knight, superheroes, more superheroes, executioner, wrestlers, more tough guys, scuba diver. I would draw characters in the books I was reading, like Treebeard and Sherlock Holmes. I was drawing all of these pictures of all kinds of people except for one kind of person. Anybody? Anybody? Notable, one notable exception. Yes, there's no women. I didn't draw women or girls. I was only drawing boys and men as a kid. And I've given this a lot of thought over the years. I have many complicated theories about it, but I won't go into all of those. But I will say that the basic deal was the representations of women that I saw in the world didn't connect with me. I didn't feel like that's who I was. I felt like I was Mickey Mouse, you know, not Minnie Mouse. Mickey is just like a neutral, generic person, and then Minnie is Mickey in drag, you know, with all this stuff added, and I just didn't relate to that. It wasn't that I thought I was male or wanted to be male. It was just that I felt like Minnie wasn't really a person. She was a female person, and I just wanted to be a person. So here I am as a little kid in the red jacket. That's me with my brothers when I was about 5. And this picture of me always feels very accurate, very consonant with who I was, who I feel like I really am. But 5 minutes later, on that very same day, I was forced by my aunt to put the barrette back in my hair. I feel like here I'm just this picture of misery. Here I'm really confident and you know, self-aware, and here I just look wretched. I don't know, maybe I'm imagining that. But my discomfort, my disconnection from myself just feels very evident here. Something has kind of gone dead. And my childhood was a constant struggle between this dead public self and my alive private self. I would wear dresses and barrettes to school, and then I'd race to get home into my real clothes. That's me and my high tops. But all too soon, I was on the verge of puberty, and they were handing out this booklet to all the girls in 6th grade. Oh, that's me on the verge of puberty. This is what they were handing out. Isn't that awesome? Oh, excuse me. Doesn't that sound like a threat? Anyhow, I resisted all of this for a little while. I was this very shy, geeky misfit in junior high. And I know you guys are all glamorous, poised, honors college students, so you don't know what I'm really talking about, but I was a pretty geeky kid. And I would sometimes get home from school and realize that I hadn't spoken to anyone all day. I would say something out loud and realize I hadn't used my voice all day. So for a long time, I looked back at this not fitting in stage as being about my lesbianism. But in fact, I feel like it went much deeper than that. There was this real lack of connection with my own agency and autonomy. And I did have this kind of false self that I'd constructed. But the fact that I was a lesbian and found myself born into a generation of other gay people who were engaged in a liberation movement built around that identity eventually helped me to get to the deeper and more personal, but also somehow more profoundly political ways that my self was being colonized. I buckled in high school. I couldn't keep up my geeky, authentic self, and I started dressing like a girl and passing like a normal teenage girl. But then I came out in college when I was 19. And I felt like I was somehow starting to get back to my true self, the one I had been as a kid without the beret. And I'm showing you these pictures, all these old photographs of myself, not because I'm narcissistically fixated at some point in my distant past, although I am. I'm showing you these pictures because I want to talk about the importance of seeing an accurate reflection of yourself in the world. Because unlike the serene young woman in the Growing Up and Liking It pamphlet, I did not see myself when I looked in the cultural mirror. But let's set that aside for a moment, and I will come back to that in a little bit. I had a curiously bifurcated college experience. That scene that I read you at the beginning about my freshman English class, that happened at a small college in Western Massachusetts called Simon's Rock, where I went for my first 2 years. And my education there was very traditional, even classical. I was a really diligent student. I had very few social distractions. I studied literature and physics and philosophy and French and history and art. It was all very well-rounded and rigorous. But then I transferred to Oberlin College for my last 2 years. And it was right after I got to Oberlin, in the fall of my junior year, that I realized I was a lesbian. And I won't say that my academic career went completely to hell, but schoolwork began occupying much less of my time. And I started doing a lot more extracurricular reading, stuff that was not assigned by any of my professors. So now I'm going to read another passage from Fun Home about this period of my education. My realization at 19 that I was a lesbian came about in a manner consistent with my bookish upbringing, a revelation not of the flesh, but of the mind. I'd been having qualms since I was 13, when I first learned the word due to its alarming prominence in my dictionary. But now another book, a book about people who had completely cast aside their own qualms, elaborated on that definition. That first volume led quickly to others. A few days later, I screwed up my courage and bought one. This book referred to other books, which I sought out in the library. One day it occurred to me that I could actually look up homosexuality in the card catalog. I found a 4-foot trove in the stacks, which I quickly ravished. And soon I was trolling even the public library, heedless of the risks. My researches were stimulating but solitary. It became clear I was going to have to leave this academic plane and enter the human fray. I went to a meeting of something called the Gay Union, which I observed in petrified silence. But my mere presence, I felt, had amounted to a public declaration. I left exhilarated. It was in that tremulous state that I determined to tell my parents. Keeping it from them had started to seem ludicrous anyway. The notion that my sordid personal life had some sort of larger import was strange but seductive. And by midterm, I had been seduced completely. Joan was a poet and a matriarchist. I spent very little of the remaining semester outside of her bed. This was strewn with books, however, in what was for me a novel fusion of word and deed. So, in my junior and senior years of college, I began this voracious reading of all this stuff that was not assigned. And not only was it not assigned, but it called much of the other stuff I'd been studying into question. I was in college just at the moment when there started to be such a thing as women's studies. But I was still too conservative to actually take a women's studies course that sounded like really kind of, I don't know, sounded kind of suspect to me. I didn't know what women's studies was. I wasn't going to have any of it. But I did start reading this stuff and eventually became very politicized by it. In the book I wrote after Fun Home is a memoir about my father, and I followed it with a book about my mother called Are You My Mother? I kind of pick up at this point in my college career. I'm going to read you a little scene from that. Wait, I'll start without the picture. Where does language come from, anyway? When I got to college, I found a lot of women asking and answering that very question. Adrienne Rich was not assigned reading for any of my classes. My new lesbian friends had turned me on to her. She was apparently a respected poet of my mother's generation, but she'd recently come out as a lesbian, a radical one and a really smart one. And this is a passage from a book of Adrienne Rich's where she's talking about Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And I'm underlining this passage that says, I was astonished at the sense of effort, of pains taken, of dogged tentativeness in the tone of that essay, and I recognize that tone. It is the tone of a woman almost in touch with her anger. Oh, wait, hang on. The essay in which Rich cites A Room of One's Own covers some of the same ground as Woolf's book, like, for example, hang on, I'm sorry, I got out of order there. Okay. Adrienne Rich understands Woolf's detachment because she once practiced it too. She says, imitating the distance and formalism of the male poets she admired. But now she was kind of going for broke. The essay in which Rich cites A Room of One's Own covers some of the same ground as Woolf's book. Like, for example, the woman writer's peculiar challenge to cease being an object and start being a subject. One of the poems my mother was writing that winter in Germany, 7 months or so before I was born, is called La Belle Dame. It copies the form of the Keats ballad, but Mom's poem is about the woman herself, not the knight's fantasy of her. What else did my mother write? Where are her letters? And now, I know I just said I hate when people read stuff out loud that I'm also looking at, but I'm going to do that anyhow right now because otherwise this doesn't really make sense. So I'm having this phone conversation with my mom. Oh, wait. Well, I'm missing a... Oh, I guess they're out of order, sorry. Okay, my mother is on the phone with me. Now I'm reading this fictional version of Plath's life called Wintering, and also Helen Vendler's book about poets' last works, including Plath's. You can see why Ted Hughes had to leave, her possessiveness, her demands. Plus, she exhausted herself making curtains and gingerbread. Why did she waste her time doing all that stuff? Well, I did it too. I thought it was important. I remember feeling very angry at Betty Friedan. And I say, what? Why? Well, she hated housework and wanted women to be independent, but then she'd hire other women to do her housework. And then I say, hey, Mom, in my book, I was talking to her about the book I was writing, the book that we're reading right now. Hey, Mom, in my book, I say that I've never read Plath and you've never read Woolf. That's true, right? Well, I've read A Room of One's Own, but none of her novels. Of course she's read A Room of One's Own. Probably in the 1970s, certainly not in college in the 50s. Woolf's biographer, Hermione Lee, reports that even in the mid-60s, Woolf wasn't read in the academy, was considered a minor modernist. It was my father, not my mother, who went to grad school. When he started at Penn State, Mom was living in the village and working as a secretary. In Dad's letters to her at that time, he enlists her aid with his coursework. He writes, my other obstacles seem small compared to this paper on Anne Bradstreet due next Wednesday. I can't possibly work on it till after I visit you this weekend. Helen, I won't be bringing any typing, but you could help me loads if you would read some of Bradstreet's love lyrics. I really hate to ask, it seems so cheap, but I am asking. So if you could get an edition of her works, she's some goddamn Puritan who writes rather hot, passionate lines to her absent husband. Please give me some ideas for a paper. And here's the real kicker, is the PS that he adds. I know you're angry as hell, but I like to see you that way sometimes. Did she get him the book? Was she angry? I guess you have to read that book and find out. Okay, so let's go back to this growing up and liking it. And as a young woman, I'm not seeing a clear reflection of myself in the world. And comics were especially terrible about the way that they represented women. I feel like, Dagwood gets to be just this kind of regular person, and Blondie is this bombshell pinup girl. And I started to wonder, what would Dagwood look like if you drew him in that same way? And around this time, I had come out, and I was starting to read all this gay stuff, and I found gay comics. And I loved the way that the gay men would draw men. This is what Dagwood would look like if you drew him like Blondie. So I just thought this was funny and liberating to think about representation in these ways. And soon after graduating from college, I began to feel this very clear sense of mission. I was gonna, if I couldn't see myself in the world, I would create that reflection. I would make the reflection myself of people like me and my friends. So I hadn't drawn women growing up, so I had to practice. It took me a while to get the hang of it. My early women were very androgynous looking. And eventually I started adding words to my drawings. And one day this happened. This was the very first episode of my comic strip. It's not really an episode, it's just a picture. I drew this woman, Marianne, dissatisfied with the breakfast brew. And for some reason, I just added this little notation at the bottom, Dykes to watch out for plate number 27, as if there was 26 more somewhere, but there weren't. But I set about making them. I began drawing these comics regularly and publishing them and stuff. Twyla is appalled to learn that Irene is a morning person. It was, the cartoons were, they turned into a soap opera, about recurring characters, but they were also sort of an op-ed column where I would talk about things that were going on in the world. A lot of my characters were English professors. I thought it was very hard keeping up with the gay and lesbian subculture. Things were always changing. Everyone's identities were continually evolving. It was hard to keep up with. This is a little scene at the mall, where the mall is like a microcosm of the country at the beginning of the Iraq War. So this is I'm going to just show you this cartoon that Lisa was referring to. I've become better known for this thing called the Bechdel test than for anything else that I've done, which is kind of weird and kind of cool. I'm trying to embrace it. But this is an early Dykes to Watch Out For cartoon where these two women are trying to decide whether they're going to go see a movie. And one of them says, well, I don't know if I can go. I can only see a movie if it satisfies 3 basic requirements. It has to have at least 2 women in it who talk to each other, about something besides a man. So they mull that over. And that's the end. It's just this weird, funny little feminist joke from the early 1980s, which no one ever would have heard of, again, except it got dug up in recent years by, I guess, film students who are actually being taught in film school that if they wanted to sell a movie to Hollywood, don't have more than 2 women in it, don't have them talk to each other about anything besides a man. So this sort of thing started up, and now there's websites that like gauge whether a movie passes the Bechdel test or not, and it's kind of cool. And I guess that's where I'll end. Let's turn the lights up, and then I'll do questions and answers if people want to talk. Thank you. Oh, how are we doing this? You're going to read them?
I'll just go down here.
Okay.
I'll just do this. I think
Okay.
I'm on the mic. And I have a few, and then if there's a few that come from the floor, that would be okay. I have a bunch, and we have some time, though, and so if there's a couple people that want to come up and ask questions of their own, I think that would be cool as well.
Yeah,
because
sure.
we have a little, is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay. That would be good. I know some folks have, this is the time in the semester where there's things like exams and whatnot,
Oh, yeah,
so I'm going to take a minute to, if
Don't
people
worry
need
if you
to
have
leave.
To go ahead.
Yeah. So some of these come from my students and other students in the Honors College who have read Fun Home, and a lot of Honors College students have read Fun Home. And so some of them are really specific to Fun Home, but they kind of get at slightly bigger issues. So you can go out from Fun Home to sort of think of them as bigger. This one's kind of fun. On page 211 of Fun Home, see, it's really specific. This is what they're taught to do with me. What page is it on? You depicted a letter from your father that said, Helen, your mom, just seems to be suggesting that you keep your options open. I tend to go along with that, but probably for different reasons. Of course, it seems like a cop-out, but then who are cop-outs for? Taking sides is rather heroic, and I am not a hero. Is being heroic about taking sides, like your father says? What do you think makes a hero? What is a hero? What makes a hero?
Huh. That's a good question. Yeah, this was a letter that my dad wrote to me right after I had come out to him and I had found out that he was gay. Or I hadn't quite, it wasn't quite clear yet. My mother had told me, but he hadn't. But we were having these weird communications in which he thought I knew and I didn't know, and it was very odd. But so when I got this letter about taking sides, I wasn't quite sure what he was talking about, but looking back, I can see he meant, people who were willing to come out and be public about their gayness and take a stand. And I don't know if that's heroic. I mean, I wouldn't say that's heroic, but I do think that in our lives we inevitably have to take positions on things that we care deeply about or that mean something to us. And if you don't, you just kind of, I don't know, you just live in this kind of shadow of misery, like my father. And it might be hard to stand up and do something, but I think ultimately, this sounds so fatuous. I can't believe I'm standing up here like talking about heroism. I don't know. I can't tell you. I guess that's my end of my answer to that. I'm sorry. I guess I'm not a hero either.
Well, in fact, I think the question partly comes from a place that's authentic to many of our students in which you are kind of heroic. I mean, for being as honest as you are in the memoir. So I think that's partly, I will say, as somebody who's taught the book for years to really great students, that's partly where that question comes from. So how do you feel about being that to them, to other people who've read the book, who see it as heroic, that you've been as that you are as honest as you are in your memoirs?
Well, I'll accept that. That's kind of cool. But I did it for my own purely selfish reasons. I just needed to, blow the lid off of this secret that had damaged my family so deeply. I needed to free myself. And I guess you could argue I could have done that without writing a book about it and publishing it, which was very hard on my family, and which, to some people seems like a very selfish thing to do, but it was just what I had to do.
So that kind of segues into another question that the students had, which was, hang on, I'm just going to find it so I get the wording right. Do you believe in omitting certain things in a memoir to spare the feelings of those close to you, or is it all fair game?
Oh, I omitted a lot. Believe me, there's a lot of, I revealed a lot, but there's a lot I kept out. And yes, unless you are like, completely cut off from everyone in the world and you don't care what they think of you and you don't have to deal with them, you're going to have to omit a few things from your memoir. I guess my position might have changed a little bit on this when I was younger, when I was still writing Fun Home and thinking about these ethical questions. I felt more like it was all fair game, or it should be all fair game. But I don't feel quite as adamantly about that anymore. I feel like you really have to leave some stuff out if you want to continue having relationships with people, like your mother. And it was hard. After I wrote Fun Home, I went on to write a book about my mother while my mother was alive and sort of looking over my shoulder. And that was interesting, too, because my father had been dead for a long time when I wrote the book about him. It's a lot easier to write about dead people.
That's another question that is in here that the students asked, and I know they ask it always when we do the book in class, is, and knowing now that there's a book that you wrote about your mother when she was alive, what is that over-the-shoulder editor? And one of the questions that comes up is, what do you think your dad would have thought about Fun Home? I mean, if he had been alive. One of the questions is, do you think that he would have thought that it was true in the way that you talk about truth in that book?
Wow. Would my father have felt that Fun Home was true? Well, it's always really hard for me to imagine my father having any kinds of feelings about Fun Home, because Fun Home wouldn't exist if my father still existed. It's completely about his death. So it's really hard to get into that hypothetical space. But if I did, I don't know. I feel like I went to a class here yesterday called Queer Lives about gay and lesbian history, and one of the things they were talking about in the class is how at different points in history, gay identity wasn't the way we think of it now, and even now it's constantly changing. So I don't know if my father identified as gay or bisexual or neither of those things. I don't know if he would have thought the book was true. Probably not. It probably wouldn't really resonate with him because he had so much invested in not acknowledging all that.
So that's a question that in some ways came up in a class that I taught last spring, and we talked a lot about this in that class, and I think I might have even written you an email at one point saying there's this really cool thing that my students were talking about with Fun Home that in some ways kind of goes to what you just said, and that is, we were talking about drag, and we were reading, some of you out there were in that class or in gender and women's studies and sexuality classes where you've read Judith Butler, and she talks about drag as sort of being always what we are when we're gendered, that we are always already in drag, whether we're cisgendered or not, we're always in drag. And And so we started talking about drag a lot in that class, and I mean, we brought it to Fun Home. And one of the students said, I think the book is about her father in drag, and I think that the house is the drag queen. That's what's getting dressed up, that's how her father is sort of enacting drag, is the house. The house is a character in that book. And we talked a lot about the house as a character, kind of as a drag queen in the book. And so I think they would like to hear you and talk about that a little bit, about drag, about how you understand drag, about whether the house is in drag.
I would agree with that. Yeah, it was like vicarious drag. Like the house could do the things he couldn't do. It'd be all frilly and beautiful, you know. I like that. And it took me a while to adjust to this new Judith Butler view of the universe. I always felt like my gender, whatever my weird gender is, was somehow inherent and authentic and just like who I was. But recently I've come to see that, yes, of course, it's all a kind of drag. And my masculine attire is, I mean, I guess that's not, it's obviously drag in the context of the straight world, but it always just felt like who I was. But we're all putting something on, I guess.
There's lots of questions about process. So I'm going to ask a couple of those because, so here's a question from a student. The images in Fun Home are so incredibly nuanced, and in everything you do, like really super detailed, that our class last semester could spend an entire class period discussing a single frame. How do you insert that level of detail without getting too caught up and being unable to proceed with the story? Do you believe in just letting it flow and then returning to it when you're done, or did you get stuck in the details often?
My creative process is one of just being completely stuck in the details. Like, I can't see the forest I'm not even in the trees. I'm like down in the bushes and the fungus. Like, it's crazy. It's very hard for me to get out of there and get an overall look at the direction that the story is going in, or even what I'm trying to say, because I get so caught up in details and going down little digressions. And part of that's the writing, but the drawing, of course, is part of it too, because there's so much research you can do. And my process has changed so much since the internet came along. When I started out doing comics, you know, there was no digital anything. It was all done by hand. And if you wanted to look up a picture of something, you had to go down to the library when they were open to the picture file where someone had cut out like images of parking meters or, you know, old cars or whatever it was you were looking for. Now you can find, of course, images of anything with a mouse click. And it's affected my work. Like if I can look something up, I will. And so I spend a lot of time on Google, as I think many writers and artists do. I think it's doing something to our brains. Okay, that's all I have to say about that.
One of the things we've been talking about over this fall with our students, and one of the plenary things that we've been doing in this Thursday night is having guests come and sort of talk about their lives with the idea that, you know, like students are thinking in college about career. I mean, they're here to learn and engage themselves, but also I think they're under a lot of pressure from their parents to have a job at the end of it, and that's part of our job here. So it's been great to have people who can come and talk a little bit about their careers. Was there a point where you thought about, you have a picture for it?
That's my picture for that. That was just in the New Yorker recently.
I love it that you were prepared for that question.
Well, I don't know if I was prepared for that question, but I feel like I'm standing up here saying, oh, my life turned out so awesome, I just do what I did when I was a little kid, but I don't advise any of you to actually do that. I was like very lucky. I just don't want you to come complaining to me in 20 years when you've tried to become a cartoonist.
At what point did you realize it was a career?
was still pretty young, but for long before I actually made a living at it, I considered it my career, but it took a while to actually be able to make it my career.
And now that you're like super famous, you talk about, I think a lot of what you talk about, and you talked about in this presentation, sort of locating yourself in history. Who was I then? How did I draw myself? How did I represent myself? How has what's been happening lately have an effect on you locating yourself in history now? Does it have a big effect on you? Do you still feel like you're the person who was drawing dikes to watch out for? Just the more people know about you now? Or does it really have an effect on sort of how you understand yourself as a self in history?
It has had a big effect on me, and I can't talk about it. I feel like really confused by it. I've had some time to adjust to just a bigger following, more people reading my work with Fun Home's success, but lately, with the MacArthur thing, it just feels like it's just really crazy. I have not quite adjusted to it. And I really can't speak about it because I feel like I'm just figuring it out. And when I write my books, I have like years to think through things, and I totally haven't had any time to think about what's happening to me now. It's very odd. And one day I hope to write about it so I can figure it out, because that's how I figure stuff out. But right now I just feel like I don't know what the hell is happening. I hardly know what I'm saying. I've been like doing so much stuff, talking to so many people. I feel like a little bit on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I'm doing okay right now, don't worry.
But that would no doubt span some great material for you. I hope it doesn't happen, but it would spawn some great material for you.
Well,
Perhaps.
I don't know, who wants to read about somebody getting a MacArthur? It's not really something you would write about.
So
An unhappy childhood, yeah, but success, not so much.
Yeah. So I just have one last question for you, and then everybody is invited next door to reception to have your book signed, to eat some things next door, and chat with Alison. But so this is a question. This is sort of from the archives, and I think that it was Professor Schreckenberger over there that first asked this question of one of our other guests. I think it was Rebecca Skloot, and the question was this: now that you're really super famous, and you are a Vermonter, and Ben & Jerry's wants to make an ice cream flavor in honor of you, Alison Bechdel, what would that flavor be, and what would it be called?
Well, I don't know, but oddly, I once sent a letter to Ben & Jerry's with a suggestion for a flavor name. It was in the 90s. They had made yet another flavor named after a male rock star, and I was all up on my feminist high horse, and I said, I was trying to think of a good example to give them, and so, but it wasn't a very good example, but all I could come up with was, why not a flavor called Anise Joplin? Needless to say, Anise Joplin was never put into production. But that's my Ben & Jerry's story.
That's a good one.
Thank you. Thanks all very much.
Thank you so much for coming.